Welcome, everybody, to the Grueling Truth Sports Network. Today, we'd like to introduce a new show called the Old Time Boxing Show. If you've been on the website, gruelingtruth.net, you know that we have all kind of boxing content. We have some of the best boxing writers in the world, from Bob Day, Jeremiah Pricer, and Christopher Shelton, who is a guy that I really enjoy reading his stuff because he goes back to the turn of the century and even farther back than that if you've read some of his stuff. He's a very good writer. I think he's one of the top boxing historians in the country today. And so we're going to start doing this show hopefully weekly. Tonight we're going to do the show about Jack Johnson. But first off, let me introduce you guys to the Grueling Truth's resident boxing historian, Christopher Shelton. How you doing, Christopher?
Good, Mike. I'm enjoying. I'm glad we're going to do this, and it's going to be a lot of fun. I hope the audience enjoys it as well.
And I mean, it's better than talking to a 22-year-old that thinks Mike Tyson's a top 5 heavyweight of all time.
Yeah, I like Mike Tyson too, but you got to go back a long ways, and this boxing is happening for minimally 3,000 years. Homer was writing about it, so there's a lot of guys to cover.
Yeah, and if you don't know the history of what you're talking about, I think you should be quiet, because you always see guys, Mike Tyson would have killed Muhammad Ali and Joe Louis, and I'm like, no, he wouldn't have.
Yeah, he might have styled against Joe Louis, better, but Muhammad Ali would have been a really, really tough one for him, because Ali ate up those kind of guys.
Yeah, my thing with Mike Tyson is this, though. I have respect for anybody that gets in a boxing ring.
Yeah.
But to me, a great champion is a guy that when he gets in trouble can recover and win, and I never saw him do that. And he had opportunities, and the thing that really sealed it for me is when he bit Holyfield, I think, just to keep Holyfield from knocking his ass out again.
Oh, I agree. He was being embarrassed. And it was ironic that was his best round. He was actually doing okay, trying to get disqualified. And I agree. I was watching that in Tijuana with a group of people, and I was outraged. And yes, I believe he just wanted to get disqualified because he felt the longer this went, he was going to get not only knocked out but embarrassed. And the one thing I will give Tyson, I know our topic is Jack Johnson, but he was at his peak, which was almost before he was heavyweight champion, just after. He was an excellent defensive boxer. He would bob his head. He was very hard to hit, and one of the things he got into his own head about his offense, and he just needed to slug and knock people out, and he stopped using defense. And once he started getting hit by bigger guys, well, he was much more vulnerable.
Well, I think a lot of that was also when he fought guys that were better fighters. The defense went away. And it's the other thing that drives me nuts about people to talk about him, and we'll get off of him here in a second, but right. I just had an argument on Facebook with a kid, and he's like, well, his prime was from 1986 to 1988. And if you're not in your prime when you're 24 years old, there's a problem there. And the problem with him was all in his head.
Yeah, he was, he is what he is, and he was, he had his moment where he was an excellent, like I said, he was an excellent defensive fighter and a great offensive punch. When he was under Teddy Atlas, he was a really good fighter. Was a late teenager and very early 20s. And as you said, though, he moved out of his prime, but it's still at a pretty young age, and he didn't even look good at all, when he got out of jail. And even before he got out of jail, he wasn't the same fighter as his late teenage years.
All right, so I know that you've written tons of boxing books, historical boxing books, published a lot of articles, including on the gruelingtruth.net, and I know that you've written multiple times about Jack Johnson, our subject today. What drew you to Jack Johnson as a guy that you really wanted to study in-depthly?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because with a lot of times these boxers from anywhere around his era, because that's where I specialize, anywhere from, actually covering lots of years, it's just because I end up having to learn things, and then I become interested in him even later in life. But Jack Johnson, for some reason, I think I just found a book on him when I was a teenager. It was a folksy book written by an African American, and I just loved the book. It was written in this sort of like you were sitting on a porch with somebody, and he was whittling away and kind of telling you stories. And unfortunately, I loved the book so much, and so I was able to get these tapes that were pre-internet. You'd find boxing's best rounds, boxing's best knockouts, boxing's best this. You had to gather a bunch of tapes just to try to find Jack Johnson stuff because wasn't so accessible. But anyway, this book, while I loved it so much, it became my poison because I have to try to get these stories out of my head. You get stories sort of grilled in your head, and the same thing watching these tapes, that it becomes something like Wikipedia. You have to be careful that you just don't realize when you're a teenager that people might not be telling you the truth.
I wrote an article about the most underrated boxers of all time, and I put Charlie Burley on it. And I got a message from Steve Lott, and it was like, have you ever seen Charlie Burley fight? And I said, yeah, I saw his fight against Oakland Billy Smith. And he sends me a message back. He says, oh, good then. You can put him on the list. He said, I just get tired of writers who have never seen somebody putting them in a list just because of what they read about them.
Well, the only thing I would question. I mean, I think he's right that if you have the opportunity to see somebody, obviously you're going to learn much more about them. But also, I have to cover people that were pre-film, and if that were the only.
But it was just the fact that I limited to guys like after 1925, 1930. So I think that's why he said, because if you're doing John L. Sullivan. You're not going to find a whole lot of film to watch. You kind of got to go off newspaper accounts of the fights.
Right, and you do learn quite a bit, because especially if you go through numerous fights, you get the idea of at least the style and stuff, and that's what I really try to do with the stuff I cover that's pre-film. Fortunately, Jack Johnson is on film. Not a lot of his fights, when he was black heavyweight champion, more so later on, But yes, I still have to include those guys. So what I try to do is to find the accounts and get a flavor. So yeah, I've got a pretty good account of Jake Kilrain versus John L. Sullivan, though there's no film of it, because I want people to know sort of what happened, and that way, otherwise again all those boxers would be excluded, and that's so many to exclude. But I do agree that hey, if you want to talk about somebody, I mean, why not look at them? I mean, your and I time, it was hard to see somebody that was, we wanted to watch a Gene Tunney fight. It wasn't necessarily that easy. You had to try to.
And if you did find one on an old tape, because I started trading with boxing collectors in like the mid to late 80s, it was hard to watch. It was yellowed. It was really grainy, which now you can find stuff. Like I've got a Joe Louis collection now that's almost mint condition, where you can really see how good a fighter he was. But with the grainy film, it's hard to judge that a lot of times.
It is, but when you're in my position, we don't even have anything. You're even grateful to have that. But you're right. The way we had to trade and try to hunt things down, going to multiple video places and trying to figure out all sorts of ways just to see the fights. But you're grateful you get kind of anything. But yes, the quality of the videos have improved, and then it's just as you said, if you're arguing with a young person, teenager today, they don't appreciate that if they want to look at a Gene Tunney fight, well, they just click on they just go right to the internet, and there it is. Well,
you go on YouTube, you can find almost anything.
Yeah, I mean, we had to pump out some money. We had to put a lot of energy into trying to find what we did, and I'll throw
videotape. It used to cost $8 to send a couple videotapes through the mail.
Oh yeah, exactly.
A videotape to put it on.
And you were just trying to get sort of a couple of rounds. You don't even really get the whole fight. You only have a little bit of the fight to see, so you could only judge kind of what you got. And you were grateful to have that. You were grateful to kind of get whatever you could get because we were collectors, so it was exciting to have something. And I just want to throw out heads out to the handball champion who also was a part owner of Tyson's career, Jim Jacobs, because Jim Jacobs was a guy who made a point of trying to gather all this stuff and then release it so that it made it easier and easier before the internet for people to see some of these fights and see some of these fighters.
Yeah, big fights. I remember buying from them. And I remember when I got Dempsey Tunney, I was all excited. And the quality wasn't great, but it wasn't bad considering it was filmed 70 or 60 years before that. So let's get back to Jack Johnson. And the interesting thing to me, like when I interview former NFL legends and stuff, is to always find out what made them tick, what their younger years were like, and what led them to be a boxer. So what led Jack Johnson to be a boxer, and what age did he start boxing?
Well, it's a little undetermined because without the newspaper proof of exactly what was happening in his early fights. But it appears what happened is he had decided that from his background, he was apparently a pretty amiable person, not the angriest person, though he had a couple incidences in his youth involving, getting literally like whipped on a ship or something like that when he tried to, to hop on it and such. And he had a couple incidents, but he mostly was a fairly cheerful guy, and he was interested in getting involved in show business. And the only real opportunities he could find was to try to join the circus in Chicago and stuff. So they just had stuff where there was pugilism involved. So he was involved in battle royales, which were, a group of black boxers would be put in the ring together, and they would fight simultaneous, and one would survive the fight and win and get the money. And Johnson was apparently good at that, and then he started parlaying into, this is maybe a way to make money. That's his circus act almost, and entertainment act. So he was almost in a sense just an entertainer. And then as he was progressing, he started getting serious and thinking, maybe this is something I can do. Maybe this is something I can make money. And increasingly, it moved in the direction of a career.
All right, and fighting through those local ranks, Johnson boxed a trilogy against a black fighter by the name of Klondike, who had declared himself the black heavyweight champion of the world. I think it was a loss, a draw, and finally a win over Klondike. What does your research brought you about those fights for the black heavyweight championship?
Yeah, Klondike was there were several good black boxers in that period. That period is something just around 1900 itself, and Klondike his struggle was against a future rock and color heavyweight champion named Frank Childs. But Klondike did well against Johnson and scored a victory, I believe a technical knockout victory, and then Johnson also defeated Klondike. And another black boxer that defeated Johnson in this time was Hank Griffin, again another very good fighter. So I'm always glad to mention these names and kind of get them out there. And Jack Johnson wasn't quite the same pugilist at that time. He had been fighting quite a bit, but this is still around 1900. And when he lost to those guys, he was much more of an offensive pugilist, where he would kind of go out there and more of a slugger than what he would become when he became champion.
Yeah, and I think the first fight that really got the media's attention, probably, at least the white media, was when he met Joe Choyinski in his ninth fight. Choyinski was a really talented boxer, and I think he ended up knocking out Johnson. Now, I've seen different things, but I did see an interview with Johnson where he kind of alluded that he was. But the thing that really took me about that when I read about that fight was the police broke up the fight after its conclusion, and the two men were thrown in jail where they became friends, and Choyinski actually, for a couple weeks, would playfully spar and actually kind of mentored Johnson.
Yes, and actually, just these names are always impossible to pronounce, but you don't use the H. It's Choyinski, and Choyinski was one of the great boxers of all time. Period.
You know what, Christopher? It's not like he can come kick my ass for it, so I'll call him what I want.
You call him what you want. Okay, that sounds good. But Choyinski is one of the quirkiest and greatest boxers of all time, and I'll tell you one of the quirkiest things about him is that he was really sort of a light heavyweight. Now, when he fought guys that were his size and smaller, he would fight them in a more offensive way, but he would take on guys that were bigger. He fought James Jeffries when James Jeffries had only had a couple draws, never knocked down. Gave James Jeffries a great 20-round draw where he just the crowd was going crazy the way he fought Jeffries. He had one opportunity. What he would do, I could tell you his style. When he fought larger guys, it was just jab, 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 coming at different angles. He had really long arms, almost looks like a basketball player more than a boxer. And then you get hit with this jab at different angles, and you're trying to struggle out what to do. He's not even throwing his right, so then you stop paying attention to it at all, and then he just ambushes you and hits you with it. And he hit Jeffries so hard in the 16th round of their fight that Jeffries' tooth embedded into his lip, and so Jeffries was in so much pain, this is before he was champion, that he said he got to quit. He can't do this. So they had to pull out a knife and cut his teeth open, blood spurting all over the place, just to relieve the pain, just so Jeffries could continue to compete against Choyinski. And Choyinski beat guys like the 1880s color champion George Godfrey. Choyinski was just a marvelous boxer, and so sometimes I've heard Jack Johnson's reputation is a little bit of because I've read like the fans type polls, and they'll say, well, how could he be that great if he's knocked out by a guy like Kowinski? Well, he was knocked out by one of the best, and what Kowinski did was he suckered Johnson by doing the same sort of thing, and Johnson never see him. You don't get to see fights of these guys on film like the boxers can today. So this guy keeps poking and pecking and hitting Johnson at different angles, and Johnson's just can't quite figure out what to do with it, and then he's not even paying attention to the right in the third round, and Kowinski nails him with it, and Johnson tries to grab Kowinski to hold on, and he can't. Kowinski just moves out of the way, and Johnson takes a 10 count, is knocked out, and it was interesting is again Kowinski's not the largest guy. He's about 5'10", 175 in that area, but in 1910 when they had the fight of the century, which we'll get to later, Jack Johnson and James Jeffries, but both of them, and Jeffries was still undefeated, both of them said the hardest punch I ever took was by Joe Kowinski. So, but his style was to ambush you with his right. You just didn't see it because he kept attacking with the left, and he learned it, or he sparred with James Corbett. So it's hard to know who taught. Corbett won the battles against Kowinski, but it's hard to know who taught who this great jab. But again, the best way to describe it is it comes at unusual angles, so it's very hard to stop it, and it was hard to get in fighting with Kowinski because it was hard to get inside him with that jab.
Yeah, and the problem for Johnson, even after Kowinski fight, which he may have lost, but he had to get people's respect because everybody knew back then how good he was. And Kowinski, ended up in the Boxing Hall of Fame in 1998. I think he got elected. But the problem was that no heavyweight champion would willingly meet a black opponent when Johnson was coming up. And this was actually a fairly recent tradition because if I remember, Tom Cribb, who was the English champion, which was considered a world title at that point, I believe, actually fought Tom Molyneux in 1810. It was John L. Sullivan who drew the color line in front of the world heavyweight titles in the 1880s. After winning his title, Sullivan retired to the stage for 3 years, citing no worthy challengers, which I think he meant there were no worthy challengers except Peter Jackson. He wouldn't fight Jackson, the Black Prince, who was a great fighter, and Jackson ended up dying penniless. But after that, you had James J. Corbett, Bob Fitzsimmons, and Jim Jeffries, who basically all held to that tradition also. Of course,
I'm sorry. Let me just say, because there really was an attempt in the 1890s to try to unify the title with a black fighter and a white fighter, and for various reasons I won't go into, it just didn't quite work out. Now it's true that Sullivan, when he was champion, got into his head. He was willing to fight black fighters before, though he didn't before he was champion, but afterwards he drew a line. It's not clear whether Corbett did fight Jackson before he was champion. It's not clear that he would have drawn a color line because he wouldn't fight anybody. He fought only 3 rounds in 5 years when he was champion, so he drew the line against everybody. And then,
and in 1903, though, you had James J. Jeffries, who became the champion. But the one thing Jeffries
drew the color line, and I just want to point out, Bob Fitzsimmons said I did not draw a color line, but it didn't work out. He was knocked out and lost his title before he had a chance. But he said,
my point is, in 1903, a lot of the media was pushing for Stan McVay to get a shot, and Jeffries just wouldn't fight him.
Yeah, they were pushing, as I said. The media was pushing even for George Godfrey to get the opportunity in the 1880s, and for Peter Jackson, and that was when it became really publicized that Sullivan was avoiding Jackson. So the media was pushing for it, and then a guy named what's his name? Parson Davies. He was trying to unify the fighter, but he was looking again. By the time the Jackson stuff brought a lot of attention, he'd come up with Bob Armstrong and thought that he was going to nurture this into a fight against the white champion, and it just didn't quite work out. So it is true there was a color line, but it's not true. If circumstances had been better, it would have happened earlier. But things went wrong, and there was people drawing a color line. It was sort of a combination of the two things, which kept this intact. And just to finish with Kowinski, so Kowinski and Johnson are both arrested and put in jail for 17 days. And so Johnson thought, hey, this is a really clever guy. How did you beat me? And Kowinski started explaining to him what he believed were defensive tactics. So Johnson took that for heart and completely changed the way he was as a pugilist. At that point, he became a defensive fighter, using a jab much more and being patient and not slugging it out with guys.
Yeah, I think that basically the quote from Kowinski to Johnson was, "Nobody that moves like you should even be getting hit."
Yeah, I can't verify he said that, but they talked a lot because they were in jail together for 17 days, so they had plenty of time to talk and such.
Yeah, and eventually James J. Jeffries, who was the champion, followed Sullivan's lead, retired. There were no challengers left, of course, except for the black ones. And then Marvin Hart, Tommy Burns fought for the vacant title. Burns won, becoming, I think he was the first Canadian heavyweight champion in that process. And he proceeded to go on a world tour from England, Paris, Australia. Johnson followed him every step of the way. And just tell us this, there hadn't been a black man to fight for the heavyweight title since, I think, Molyneux. But what was it that got Burns to fight Johnson?
Well, one of the things I do as a historian is I say, because this is sort of a segregated situation, there are black and colored heavyweight champions, so I just call them equal champions. So it's important to know.
It's kind of like baseball when you had the Negro League champions and the World Series.
Yeah, but it is definitely true that the white heavyweight champion was considered sort of the real champion, while the black or colored, because there were different titles. That's why I'm using those words. There was a colored heavyweight champion, and then there became a black heavyweight champion, both two different titles, and then it unified into a black heavyweight champion. But anyway, Jack Johnson became both the colored and the heavyweight champion by 1902, just a year after Kowinski, and so he's the best. He's the best heavyweight probably from 1902 to 1907, and he was heavyweight champion. He just wasn't the unified heavyweight champion. And when you look at the people that followed James Jeffries, guys like Tommy Burns, they're significant. Marvin Hart, was not real small, but he wasn't a large guy either. But they were Jack Root was a smaller guy. These are smaller guys than Jack Johnson. So, and that's when film is really coming out more and more. The first boxing film that was heavyweight title fight was 1897, 1894. Thomas Edison, did an exhibition boxing bout with Corbett. But anyway, you're finally seeing film of these boxers, and Jack Johnson looks remarkably bigger than these white guys, because these white guys look sort of puny. So there's almost an impression that, geez, boxers were so small back then. But that's not true. There were large boxers. Denver Ed Martin was a big guy. Bob Armstrong. They were bigger than Johnson. And James Jeffries himself was a really, very muscled big guy. But at that time, when the films are coming out, it's the smaller white guys who are prominent if you're looking back on it today. So I saw a guy like Tommy Burns, and Tommy Burns is like 5'7", and only around 165 pounds. And yes, the English started teasing that Jack Johnson's your masters, obviously using slave references and stuff. So what induced Tommy Burns to do it was just money, and that Jack Johnson, one of the things he did that was really smart was he agreed to take, significant less money. That I think 35,000, I believe, was the paycheck, and Burns was going to get 30,000. He took 5,000. There have been some boxers that have had an opportunity to fight for the title, but they were going to get cheated, and they said, well, I'm not going to do it. But Jack Johnson said, no, this is my chance, and I'm not going to lose this opportunity. And whatever the racism was in America, he said the racism to him in Australia was much worse. He said it was the worst situation emotionally that he had to deal with. And then he finally got to fight Burns, and completely dominated him. I mean, it wasn't even close. Johnson won every single round, and Johnson's laughing as he's fighting Burns. So he's not only fighting the white champion, but he's laughing as he's doing it. And Burns can't really do anything against Johnson. And finally, the 14th round, what Johnson would do is he would occasionally throw punches. He would sense when he thought he was near the knockout, and when he would wait, and then when he'd all of a sudden go for a flurry of punches, and they knew Burns was close to a knockout. They were filming it, but they didn't want to film a black man knocking out a white man. And so they said, you know what, they were only going to go like one more round with Burns here if he isn't looking any better. And then Johnson went for the knockout, and police jumped in, filming was stopped, and to the credit, they said Jack Johnson's now the new heavyweight champion, though again he's been the heavyweight champion, the black heavyweight champion, the colored heavyweight champion for already more than 5 years. But now he's the unified heavyweight champion. There's only one heavyweight champion. There's no more, and that heavyweight champion is Jack Johnson.
All right, so my next question is, Joe Gans was a beloved champion by everybody. He was a lighter champion, lightweight champion. So why do you think that Johnson was treated differently from the time he won the title? Do you think it's because of the way he conducted himself outside of the ring? Or do you think it's more because the heavyweight champion of the world is considered the baddest man on the planet, and white people didn't like the idea of a black man being the heavyweight champion?
It was probably a little bit of both, because that's what Parson Davies' theory was. The Chicago promoter was, America will accept a black heavyweight champion, which they probably would, but they thought it should be what eventually became Joe Louis the next time around. There's going to be a specific kind of guy, and he felt that Peter Jackson was that kind of guy, and eventually Bob Armstrong was that kind of guy. It was the kind of guy that would be very humble, very respectful toward the white race, somebody that wouldn't offend anyone, and Jack Johnson was a hellraiser. He wasn't really a bad guy, but he liked to do what he liked to do. He was a free spirit, and now that you got a black heavyweight champion, who's no question the heavyweight champion, and he's a free spirit doing whatever he wants to do, driving fast cars, dating the white prostitutes, but he married one of them. But anyway, he's dating white women openly. He's just a party guy. He's a fun guy. But white America was not happy having a partier and a loud black man who's dating white women and doing whatever he wants, who is driving a fast car and flashing good clothes and at that time. So it was always going to be a problem for the first black heavyweight champion that was unified. But Jack Johnson exasperated things by his behavior, which again was not criminal behavior. It was just a carefree, I don't care what you think about me.
Yeah,
in fact, there was a lot of, just to point this, there was a lot of people prominent in the black community who were upset with Jack Johnson because they did feel, hey, look, this is our opportunity, and you're blowing it by the way you're acting, and that they thought he should be acting also very humble, very nice, not doing wild things because this is so high profile. But Jack Johnson didn't care what the black community thought of him, and he didn't care what the white community thought about him. He was going to do what he was going to do.
Now, in a curious twist, though, Johnson himself kind of drew a collar line in front of the title as well. When the great Sam Langford begged Johnson for a title fight, the two men had already met numerous times, Johnson confided that he was sorry, but no one wanted to see two black men fight for the world title, which was a view that was supported by the papers at the time, and the best black heavyweights were in exactly the same position that they had been in through history, even after Jackson broke through. In fact, I think Sam McVeigh and Sam Langford fought each other like 15 times waiting for a title shot, which never came. Was this something you think where Johnson was worried he may lose to these guys, or was it really about the money?
Well, Johnson was very motivated by money. He was a businessman. He was a person who could even handle his own affairs. But I think one of the things that's very consistent with heavyweight history, and maybe all boxing, but I specialize in heavyweights, is it's this tremendous grind to get to the top, and you're training and fighting so much, and then when you reach the champion, when you become champion, it's very common for these guys to all of a sudden stop boxing, stop fighting anybody. That's why I said when I mentioned Corbett, did he draw a color line? I go, Corbett really drew a color line. He wouldn't fight anybody of any color. And you had that with all these guys. Sullivan took long breaks when he was a champion. Corbett only fought 3 rounds in 5 years. You couldn't get Fitzsimmons into the ring. So Johnson just kind of did what all these guys did, what Dempsey eventually did, that Willard did it when he became champion. They just become champion, and they've been fighting so much that now all of a sudden they have the good life. Finally, they have a chance to enjoy, all the reward of all that hard work. And Jack Johnson fought a lot of fights, and again had been the black and colored heavyweight champion years before he became the unified one. And he decided, he really didn't want to fight anybody. When he became champion, he didn't fight that much post championship, and not really quality guys when he did.
And then, of course, we come to the era of the Great White Hope, which I think we still have. If you had a white American heavyweight now that was good, he would be huge. But anyone who could make the weight had gloves strapped on to give it a shot. Even Stanley Ketchel, who was one of the greatest middleweights of all time, he had no business in the ring, stepped in, took a shot at Johnson's title, left with a few less teeth.
Well, I'd like to mention that because that was supposed to be a staged fight. That was not supposed to be a real fight.
Yeah,
What Ketchel was supposed to do with Johnson, and Johnson was getting paid, was to just carry Ketchel and just keep it, for 20 rounds, and then Ketchel would be able to sell the films. Boxing films were very, very popular. In fact, boxing films are the first films to ever make money in the movie industry.
Yeah, they were shown in movie theaters, weren't they?
Oh yeah, the very first person that was a paid movie star was James Corbett, and James Corbett's the first one to receive royalties when he sued Thomas Edison. There's a lot of interesting things involving boxing. Anyway, Ketchel wanted to have this film and looking good against Jack Johnson, completely staged. But one of the conditions was he wasn't supposed to do anything that was unexpected. So there's even a couple moments where Jack Johnson accidentally hits Ketchel too hard, and Ketchel starts to fall down, and Jack Johnson grabs him and keeps him from falling down. And puts him back on his feet. So what Ketchel does in the 14th round is he sees an opening, and Jack Johnson's, this is just staged. It's supposed to go 20 rounds, and Ketchel nails Jack Johnson and knocks him to the ground. And I mean, Jack Johnson, whatever, as amiable a person as he usually was, there is definitely stuff that happened in his youth, and whatever it was, it came out. It came out in a rage, or just crazy rage, which nobody wanted to see at that time in a lot of white America. They didn't want to see a black man knock a white man out, and this was their worst nightmare. Jack Johnson gets up in a complete rage, and within 5 seconds of being knocked out, he hits Ketchel so hard, he not only knocks him unconscious, he knocks his teeth out. And you can see the Jack Johnson on the teeth are embedded on his glove, and he's knocking the teeth to the ground. So they not only saw a black man knock out a white man, it was the worst nightmare. It looked just vicious. It remains to this day, no matter how many boxing bouts have been going on, maybe the most vicious knockout punch of all time, and certainly up there. And again, it was all because Ketchel, he tricked Jack Johnson, and Jack Johnson made him pay for it, and that was completely spontaneous rage on Jack Johnson's part. But it wasn't meant to be a serious fight, but boy, it sure got people's attention.
Yeah, and of course, then it goes back to James Jeffries, who had retired to be, an alfalfa farmer 5 years earlier. You got James Corbett, you got the encouragement of John L. Sullivan. He decides to get back in the ring with Jack Johnson. You want to talk a little bit about that fight? Because to me, the three biggest fights in the history of boxing, Johnson Jeffries, Louis Kahn II, and Ali Frazier, and it was all because of political ramifications and stuff that went beyond the boxing ring.
Yeah, I think you meant Louis Schmeling too.
Yeah, that's what I meant. What I said,
that's all right.
Louis Kahn, probably.
No problem. Louis Kahn's first one was a great fight, though. But anyway.
But it wasn't like those fights.
It definitely did become a color line issue, and James Jeffries had retired undefeated, never been knocked down, 2 draws, one of them against Kowinski, another one against Gus Rulin, and he was a very tough, bullish, slugging kind of guy. He took a lot of punches. He wasn't a clever boxer or anything like that, but he could take a lot of punishment, and he landed body punch after body punch after body punch. Joe Jeffries did fight black guys before he was champion, but you got to hold against him that he had this color line, so that has to be held against his legacy. Anyway, after he retires as undefeated champion, he gains a lot of weight. I mean, he's way over 300 pounds. We know that because he's a boxing referee, and he is completely out of shape. But then there does start to become the Great White Hope, and he became the first really famous Great White Hope person, and he becomes induced that you got to come out here and bring back the championship to the white race. And then the claim against Jack Johnson was, well, you didn't fight the best. So Johnson was willing to fight Jeffries. He just wanted to make sure the negotiations this time around were going to go a lot more in his direction. So Jeffries, in a sort of several months period, tries to lose all this weight and get back to shape when he's about 100 pounds overweight going in. And now while he is training physically, he's also trying other methods. He's trying to use taking pills, laxatives, so he's going to the bathroom a lot, all kinds of things he didn't used to do.
He's trying to lose the weight.
trying to lose the weight. So he's losing it much too fast, and he never did get anywhere near in shape. He was still over 250 pounds, while Jack Johnson came into the fight overweight too, but Jack Johnson did train hard for that fight. He played and had fun, but and he enjoyed it. Jack Johnson was a fun guy, and it's not really quite fair to say everybody hated Jack Johnson, just because he was black, because Jack Johnson, one thing he could do is he could charm people, and also a person, Spike Lee used to point out, a person can be a racist and like Magic Johnson, a person can be a racist and still like a black athlete or a black entertainer. So anyway, Jack Johnson did have his fans and supporters, and when they went to the training camps and such, Jeffries was always a moody, unfriendly guy. He did not take to being a celebrity well, even when he was champion. And when he was champion, he was an unpopular champion. He was always called names. You're dumb, you're slow, you're clumsy, all kinds of stuff. So he didn't really like celebrityhood, and he really didn't like people. While Jack Johnson loved people, Jack Johnson was a people person. So people were finding themselves always drawn to his personality and such. But yes, there were many who wanted James Jeffries to win solely based on skin color, and it became the fight of the century. And John L. Sullivan was a correspondent for the New York Times. And John L. Sullivan, to his credit, he had stopped his drinking. Drinking had a lot to do with, it's not an excuse, but he was a jerk, when he was an alcoholic. And anyway, when he turned it around, he decided first of all Corbett was in Jeffries' camp, and so was Kowinski, but Sullivan couldn't relate to these people. Jeffries wasn't very nice to him or respectful to him. Corbett never pretended to like Sullivan, though they did have a famous handshake that's caught on film. But meanwhile, when you go to Jack Johnson's camp, everybody was really nice. Jack Johnson always called him Captain John, and he would ask, Johnson always put a stop to everything, treated him like he was king, treated John L. Sullivan how John L. Sullivan was used to being treated. And then, but he would always ask John L. Sullivan, Captain Jack, if I win this fight, fair and square, will you write that in your paper? And John L. Sullivan, yes, I will. And then to his credit, these pugilists were interviewed of who they thought would win, even the black pugilists, and a lot of the black pugilists did not like Jack Johnson either. Pretty much everybody said James Jeffries is going to win this fight, and the only one who wouldn't say what he thought, but he alluded to who he thought would win because he was looking at their training. I mean, James Jeffries wasn't really sparring against anybody. He was mostly just getting in physical sort of shape as best he could, while Jack Johnson was also sparring a lot. And so he looked at this.
I kind of compared this real quick to like Muhammad Ali when he fought Larry Holmes. And then all of a sudden he weighs 217 pounds.
Yeah, that's a good point. Good. That's a really good example.
Oh man, he's young again. When he's really not, he just looks young again.
And you're probably right. He's probably doing kind of bad habits, trying to lose the weight that you don't have to do when you're younger. But you're just trying to lose it too fast, too hard. And yes, you're what you do is you saw Ali was much slower, looked almost like a zombie, lethargic, and Jeffries wasn't quite like that, but he's not really hitting Jack Johnson at all with his punches. He's just kind of grabbing Jack Johnson and pushing him backwards, and Jack Johnson's allowing himself to be pushed backwards for most of the fight.
From what I saw of the fight, this is the way I take it. When a guy was an aggressor with Johnson, Johnson would beat the hell out of him, and I think the problem was Jeffries was normally an aggressor, and when you get older and you've been off 5 years, you come back and your mind sees something, but your body can't respond. So I think he was fighting his normal style, just he couldn't get the punches off the way he used to be able to.
Yeah, I agree. I agree, because one thing is it wasn't that Jeffries was a guy who was a headhunter. He really wasn't that kind of fighter in general. So Jack Johnson, he's got him in fighting, and he's grabbing Johnson, but he can't pull the plug to land these body punches, because that's his meat and potatoes. And if you've got the guy in fighting, you should be able to land some body punches, if nothing else. But you're right, he just can't get the arms to respond right. So all he's really doing is losing a lot of energy by pushing this guy around the ring all the time, while Jack Johnson lets himself get pushed around the ring and just waits until the guy gets tired. But John O'Sullivan wrote in his column after the fight, he said the best man won, but he also said that that Jeffries did not win a single round, not one. And so finally in the 15th round, and again Jeffries has never been knocked down, Jack Johnson knocks him down, and it's a shocking photo. And as you said, when you said the three moments in history, the sight of Jack Johnson standing over James Jeffries, and at that time, a puzzling thing is with the film you see what Johnson does. He looks into the crowd. Now Johnson was a person like John L. Sullivan. They actually would talk to spectators at the time, and he talked to John L. Sullivan between rounds. But it was shocking. And then Jeffries gets up. Jeffries is in trouble. There wasn't a neutral corner rule at that time, and Jack Johnson knocks him, tangled into the ropes, and there's no way Jeffries is getting up. And the spectators, a person in Jeffries' corner, and also a sports writer, they start trying to. Jeffries can't get up. They kick him in the butt and push him up to his feet to try to get him to stand. And at this point, they had already had a thought that if Jeffries is going to get knocked out, they're going to jump into the ring and force a disqualification. But the chaos is so crazy. By the second time Jeffries is pushed into the ring, that's when Johnson goes for the kill, lands several punches, and Jeffries is down for the third and final time and counted out. And they weren't able to get in the ring and disqualify it. So Jack Johnson got his knockout, and it really probably cost him a lot of money because there were film rights. This was going to be the biggest film in history, but the idea was, well, Jeffries should knock Johnson out in about 8 rounds, and if he does that, they both had a percentage of the film profits. So, but because Johnson won, the film was banned. It wasn't not only not being shown, it was banned from being shown by Congress. And so, in an ironic sort of way, Jack Johnson lost a lot of money because he won the fight.
So my question would be here, and I've read some of this stuff before where people claim this, but I've read that Jeffries was under the assumption that the fight was going to be won by him and be fixed. Was there anybody that tried to get Johnson to take a dive and offered him part of the film rights or just more money?
No, I've covered pretty much the training on both grounds. It all started in San Francisco, and then San Francisco's, it was illegal to hold it in San Francisco, and San Francisco said, well, we're going to do it anyway. Anyway, it managed to get both the state and the national legislature involved, so they had to move over to Reno to even hold this fight. So I've covered this thing over a period of several months and written about it if people are interested in it online. But no, it doesn't appear to.
Yeah, you can find that at thegruelingtruth.net too, can't they?
Yeah, sure. If I haven't sent it to you, I will send it to you.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you have. I'm pretty sure we posted that a few months ago. So
yeah, I think so.
Read the article. It's a great article too.
Thank you, but I cover the entire training and stuff like that. And no, this is not. This is clearly something that that they're both taking very serious. They're both taking it seriously. But I think there was an assumption that James Jeffries was going to win this fight and win it fairly easily. And for just the purposes of an audience at that time and how long a film should be, 6 to 8 rounds knockout would be perfect, but there wasn't anybody that was taking a dive. There was just an assumption that Jeffries would do this.
Yeah, and it seemed like the hatred for Johnson intensified after this. And I know there were race riots. I mean, black men were hung from this. I've read that white men committed suicide because of it.
Yeah, I don't know about hangings and suicides, but there were riots, and there was a general chaos, and then there were that sorts of things. And then Johnson's public life, again, being with the white women, and it definitely did take on a more racial tone than it had earlier in his career. And again, I should point out that before he was champion and before he was even a colored or black heavyweight champion, he wasn't hated by white people so much because he, was a nice guy to the fans and stuff. And one of the things that really caused these problems was his habit of smiling and sort of laughing in the ring at his opponent. But originally, he sort of did that because he wanted, it was to make sure that if he knocked out a white guy, that there wouldn't be a riot wherever he was, or there'd be problems. So he was trying to show, hey, I don't take it personally. He'd laugh at the fans, and hey, I'm just I'm just having a good time. But Jack London, when he fought Burns, was incensed by this. And Jack London, great rider. I just A Piece of Steak is one of the greatest boxing stories in history. Love Jack London's writing. Love To Build a Fire. But the man was a racist, a bad racist, and he was one of the ones instigating this whole James Jeffries gets into the ring and saves the white race stuff. And then Johnson, when so high profile after the Jeffries fight. Now there was no doubt who was the best. There was absolutely no doubt. And then the dating white women, became more of a problem than even the hell-raising sort of stuff. And
his first marriage to Etta ended in tragedy.
Yeah, she committed suicide.
The papers insisted she took her own life due to solitary existence and him being a player. And then you get to the 18-year-old Lucille Cameron, who would ultimately bring down the champion with the Mann Act and all that. You want to talk a little bit about Lucille Cameron, his relationship there? And I know it was made out by the newspapers that he was basically stealing the teenage daughter from the parents, when the truth was, when he met her, she was working as a prostitute, and he took her away from that.
Yeah, that's really most of the white women he dated. They were prostitutes, because also, for these white women to be in public with Jack Johnson would bring, a certain scorn on them, and prostitutes are the one group of people who a lot of times don't care what anyone thinks of them. So yes, they were prostitutes, and probably very nice women. I mean, a prostitute can be a very nice woman and have morals, and that's just how she's making her living. But anyway, Jack Johnson, that's who he was dating, and the first wife did commit suicide, and probably for both reasons that you mentioned. One, that this public scorn against her for dating a black man, and two, he was probably cheating on her and making her feel bad. And then the second time around with they invented what they call a Mann Act, which was really just to come up with a law or to put Jack Johnson in jail. So they claim he brought an underage girl over state lines to pimp her out, and
for immoral purposes, which I'm sure Johnson didn't. I mean, his intentions probably weren't.
No, I think
they weren't criminal.
No, I think it was just absolutely that now, and there are films of it now, him being with a white woman, and these were consensual situations. I mean, if it wasn't, I would not say. I mean, I say, I don't care what other people think. Mike Tyson's convicted of rape. Period. He's a rapist. So I don't defend people if they do the wrong thing. But it doesn't appear that Jack Johnson was doing anything immoral other than white women he had a legal right to date white women, but they just wanted to come up with a law to sort of put an end to it.
Let's just put it this way: morality is subjective by the person whose morals you're talking to.
That's probably true. I wouldn't want a statue put up of me, or they'd probably take it down. I think you could take a statue down of anybody. Everybody's got their morality
that's
thing.
Why they shouldn't put statues up to people.
Maybe they should. Maybe in many ways, maybe none of us deserve one ever if it's judged that way. And you're right.
No, because everybody's done something they shouldn't do that they wouldn't be proud of and they wouldn't want other people to know about.
Right, and as you said, it's subjective. So if he marries a white prostitute, it's subjective whether you think that's moral or immoral. I mean, I don't look at it as immoral, but somebody else looks at it as immoral. Even if he just dated a prostitute, some people would say that's immoral. I don't think it's immoral. It's a question of how you think. Or a white man and a black man, white woman and a black man, or vice versa. A black man may not be happy about a black woman dating a white man, but another black man might not have a problem with it. Everybody has what it is. One group of one part of Mexico may think something of whoever, and another part of people from Mexico think about this person something different, depending on all kinds of things. Everybody, as you said, it's morality is just completely subjective, except for I'd like to think if Mike Tyson convicted of rape, that most people would think that's wrong. But a lot of people defend the guy on it. So they're hey, what, she should have been alone in a hotel room. She should have known what she was getting into. So you're right. These things are completely subjective.
Do something to somebody that doesn't want it done, even if she's someplace she shouldn't be. Johnson was forced into political exile in France. He defended his title 3 more times before fighting Jess Willard in Cuba. You get the famous fight with him laying there, shielding his eyes from the sun. Willard had little to no boxing talent to speak of, let's face it. Johnson had lost that fight. You want to talk a little bit about the Willard fight in Cuba?
Sure, and I'll even go with this, that when you say almost from the time he fought James Jeffries to Willard that we could just kind of skim over it. You really can almost skim over it. I will mention one of the title fights, though, just because it's worth noting, and that was the 2 years later in 1912 when he fought fireman Jim Flynn. And Jim Flynn's a much smaller guy who eventually scored a first-round knockout of Jack Dempsey, which would be his claim to fame.
One
but
of the
anyway,
dirtiest fighters of all time, too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's the only reason I wanted to mention it. When Mike Tyson...
That's why I brought up the dirty.
When Mike Tyson bit the ear off of Holyfield in 1997, I had to tell people that it is the dirtiest heavyweight fight since 1912, and I'm going back to Jim Flynn. And Jim Flynn, because he couldn't penetrate not just Johnson's jab. Johnson wasn't really jabbing; he just stuck his arm out, and Jim Flynn couldn't do anything. It's very funny and amusing until Flynn decides to keep sneaking under the arm and banging at the top of his head into Johnson's jaw, and he does it over and over and over again. Now, wasn't only 5,000 people to fight. No one really thought Flynn had a chance, and he didn't. But anyway, it is one of the dirtiest fights ever. And then fortunately, the referee disqualified Flynn. So I only wanted to mention it because it's an interesting fight and not a competitive fight. And then to get to Willard, you're right. Willard hadn't fought very much. He was a circus strongman, huge guy, 6'6", over 230 pounds, and terrific shape. He had fought a few times. He even killed a guy in the ring. Gave him a 11th round. The guy had a brain hemorrhage. Within hours after the fight. So Willard, I guess, could create some damage, but that's not what he was supposed to do versus Jack Johnson. What they had done is, because Jack Johnson later claimed that he took a dive, which he didn't take a dive. But what they had done is they had finally rigged the circumstances against him. Johnson hadn't been fighting. He wasn't in shape. He was now 37 years old. So these fights were usually 20 rounds. They changed it to 45 rounds this time, and they put it in Havana, Cuba in the summer. So the conditions were going to be brutal if you were an older man, and so they didn't want a boxer to beat Jack Johnson. They wanted a guy who, if Jack Johnson hit him and even knocked him down, because it wouldn't really matter as long as Willard could get up, and he did, and he didn't knock down Willard.
And last until
until Jack Johnson tires. And Jack Johnson, if the fight had been 20 rounds, which is what these things are usually scheduled for, Jack Johnson would have won, but it wasn't. It was purposely put to 45 rounds, just an astounding amount when you consider it 3-minute rounds. And finally, in the 26th round, you can tell Jack Johnson wants to win because he does. He finally goes for it, and it was one of the things Johnson would always do. But I think in this case, this was his last gas. He throws everything he can at Willard, punch after punch, nails, and then he's just worn out. Completely worn out, and Willard's able to pop him to the jaw and knock him down, and it's hard to know whether it was the punch itself, and I don't think so. I think Johnson was just dead tired, and so he puts his hand over his eyes to shield himself from the sun, and he just can't get up. So it wasn't a rigged fight, and Johnson didn't take a dive, but the conditions were set the conditions were set in an unfair way. Yeah, and it was set up so that he would wear out, and that would be what Willard could do, was just take a beating, and if it went 35 rounds, Willard would still be standing there, and Johnson would be getting, way over his head. He never fought that much in his prime.
Heavyweight champion in like 1915.
Yeah. So it was 1915 when they had the fight, and it was crazy. It was Jack Johnson in his youth and in his heyday and his prime. When his prime would have been probably, maybe before he was heavyweight champion. His prime might have been 1904 to 1908. That was probably his prime, and he just couldn't. It was too much. The conditions were set against him, and it worked.
All right, so after his retirement, how was his life leading up to his death, the rest of his existence?
Well, Jack Johnson did a smart thing. Finally, he said, I'm tired of running around from, American authorities who've convicted him, when he wasn't there of this crime, which, they just invented for him. But he goes back and he takes, goes to jail for a year. He said, and I'm just going to do my time. And it was probably the smartest thing he ever did, because as soon as he got out, the tide had changed, even though the color line would get reinstated again, and nobody would fight a black fighter wouldn't get an opportunity until Joe Louis in 35 or 36. But Jack Johnson, went on the vaudeville. He did a lot of boxing exhibitions. Did on the stage. He told jokes. Very popular, extraordinarily popular. And by 1950, he had died going to a Lewis fight in a car crash, which he was a very bad driver, a fast driver. He did this all the time. But by 1950, he was voted the best heavyweight champion in history. And in his lifetime, he was really well liked. Did even exhibitions for the World War II savings bonds. So people have a way of liking ex-champions, and his amiable personality, which he always had, and he could have been bitter about spending that time in jail, and if he was, he hid it. But he had a way with people, and it really worked for him. Had we have so many stories of boxing champions having a terrible future, and he did not have a terrible future. And if he died in a car crash, if he died sort of hell-raising one more time, I think you'd be fine with that.
All right, Christopher. I think for our first show, I think this went well, and I'm glad that we're doing it, and love the information that you have.
I enjoy talking to you, Mike, and I always enjoy all your stuff. You baseball, football, you do it all. I imagine you must really, really keep busy. But yes, I enjoy doing boxing, and I enjoy this show. So I hope it continues.
Yeah, so we'll talk here in a little bit. When we get done, just stay online. We'll figure out what we're going to do next week's on.
Sounds great.
All right, guys, I want to remind you can go to grillingtruth.net to find all of our boxing content from Jeremiah Pricer, Bob Day, the historical content from Christopher Shelton, John Responte, Dennis Taylor. They got the Ringside Boxing Show. They had Deontay Wilder on last week before his title defense against Berman Stavern. Make sure you check all of that out. You can hear all of our shows on iHeartRadio, iTunes, Spreaker, Stitcher, TuneIn, any place you find sports podcasts, you'll find The Grueling Truth. So for Christopher Shelton, I'm Mike Goodpaster. You've been listening to The Grueling Truth, where the legends